This is a little bit different. This is kind of a major change, and this has been in the appendix since the beginning of the fiscal year as well. We remained silent on it, waiting until your FA funds were out there and ready for obligation, and that time has come. So we wanted to make sure that you are aware of this change that occurred in the appendix, and it is also reflected in the policy. It's a change and a shift in the position and the training that we have been consistent with up until this point, so you need to be specific and very clear to this change. We have always said that you should not make modifications just for a scenario payment schedule scenario change, and that is the big shift. So we have modified the appendix so it will be in effect for FY14 and out. It's not retroactive to the prior years, but the modification needs to occur prior to practice installation, just like all modifications. It needs to be as the result of a major design change. For example, you have estimated that you were going to use gravel in the construction. After the engineering design was completed, it was determined that gravel would not be adequate and you need to substitute concrete. That's not a practice substitution. That is a scenario substitution. And that will now be allowed if it meets the criteria that is listed here, and that is it's either an increase or a decrease more than 10% in cost. We don't want you chasing nickels and dimes. These are typical scenarios, and we still stand by, we're not trying to do cost share. We are doing payment schedules based on typical scenarios, but we do have the latitude to change if there's a significant change in the design. And the other criteria that needs to be met is it needs to be clearly defined either in the practice narrative or the scenario description so that the participant is clearly informed that there is a change in the design and the requirements of that practice installation. We don't want it to be perceived as an arbitrary change just to change the dollar amounts. So if they can't tell by looking at the forms and the documentation that there is a significant change, like the example from gravel to concrete, and we shouldn't be making that change because we need to be clear and forthright with our participants as to what they're agreeing to. This subpart G change is also a fairly significant change, and I'm going to only touch on it very briefly here because it's quite a lengthy piece of policy in 512.65, and I would encourage you to study it, and then we can maybe discuss it more later once you've had time to digest it. But in brief, we have included in policy a special waiver authority for these two practices, brush management and herbaceous weed control. It's not to be extended to any other practices. It's only for these two practices, which would allow payment for multiple treatments which are required to meet the full practice standard. In order to schedule multiple payments for these two practices, there must be an approved waiver, and that waiver must be approved by both the Deputy Chief for Programs and the Deputy Chief for Science and Technology. Once that waiver for the state has been granted, then the state, that waiver is only applicable and can only be used in contracts that year. So if the state wants to exercise that authority again in the following fiscal year for another batch of contracts, they'll have to request that authority again. But just like any other policy waiver, it's applicable to the contract for the full life of that individual contract for which it applies. So we don't want you to think that you have to apply for a waiver every time you're going to make the payment. It's just the waiver is applicable to that contract. There are significant documentation requirements that must be submitted for this waiver up to headquarters for the science and technology review and the programs review. So all of those criteria are listed, and I'm not going to go through them in great detail right now. And like